It's time for our next session. Get ready to learn, interact, and enjoy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Vasundhara, and today I'm going to talk to you about lofty linguistic ideals and deploying in tech realities. And at this point, you should see my title screen, and I'm going to introduce myself to you more formally as well. So, my name is Vasundhara, and I use ze, them, and they, them pronouns. And I currently work as a speech recognition engineer at Dialpad. And before that, I did a bachelor's degree in computer science and linguistics, where I was also a research assistant at a couple of labs. At the discourse processing lab, I worked on computational methods to process text in both English and French for various discourse analysis purposes. And at the phonological processing lab, we used to study sounds and mental representations of these sounds by both children and adults. So both of these pieces have been connected to my work as a speech recognition engineer. And also, I did an 8-month stint at GE Digital as an intern, where I had a purely software engineering role, and my job was all about just shipping code. And so, as you can see, I'm kind of in this unique position where I've had a background in both linguistics and computer science. And often what I've found is that these have competing demands. So linguistics often asks that you think about variation among your speakers and all of the ways in which language can differ from person to person, and that you describe those as they are and also sort of address them with the tech that you build. Now, software engineering, on the other hand, really prizes kind of simplifying things. So cutting things down, reducing complexity, making sure that you have code that sort of scales very quickly and is has very simple cyclomatic complexity. And so sometimes these things can be in conflict with each other, where linguistics sort of wants you to do more and computer science wants you to do less. And my talk essentially talks about how you can resolve some of these. And I do this by sort of presenting you some of the problems that I faced at work and kind of taking you through some examples and asking you what you would do in that situation. And then giving you some ideas for solutions based on my sort of work at Dialpad for the last 2 years and a bit. So let's launch straight into the first problem, which is you have a lexicon and what words do you decide to add to it? So for those of you that don't know, or for those of you who maybe do something like speech recognition without a lexicon is basically a list of words that your model knows and often their pronunciations as well. So essentially, when you use a method of speech recognition that does not, that uses a lexicon, then if you have a word that is not in your lexicon, your speech recognition model will never be able to transcribe it. So linguistics is going to say that it would like for you to add all possible English words to this lexicon, because people can say anything. It's possible for any sort of combination of new words to be strung together. And for you to be able to have a hope of transcribing it, these words need to be in your lexicon. And in fact, linguistics would also say to have a broad definition of what a loan word is, and to account for things like code switching, where people sort of combine different languages together in speech. And this isn't just necessarily word-to-word substitutions, but sometimes it can be entire phrases. Now, on the other hand, software engineering will tell you that as you add more and more words to your lexicon and your lexicon gets bigger, your model will also get bigger. And then that is a problem for a lot of software engineering reasons. So when you have more options to choose from, your model kind of can sometimes get slow. And so your latency goes up. And additionally, if you have just a larger model, it's more costs to sort of move it around. And it's, it generally just sort of costs more to sort of start it up in terms of time as well. And in addition to that, sometimes when you inflate the lexicon and there are simply more options to choose from, that can result in you making more mistakes and having a higher word error rate, which is the metric that we use to measure how good our speech recognition is. So how do you resolve this conflict? Because if you don't have a word, you can't transcribe it. But if you have too many words, you end up sort of making mistakes because you have too many options to choose from and you're slower. So as you sort of ponder that, I want to give you some actual concrete examples of terms. And I want you to tell me in the chat whether you would add or not add these words. And so the first example that I'm going to give you is let's jump. So just tell me Y for yes in the chat, N for no, and D for depends. Or you can type out the whole words. And for context, a let's jump is a specific kind of jump in figure skating that's illustrated at the bottom of my slide. And so that is something that, if you watch figure skating at the Olympics, you might have heard of that before if you've done figure skating yourself. So just tell me in the chat, would you add it? Yes, no, or it depends. Now, the second term is mens rea, which is Latin for guilty mind. And it's basically the mental element of someone's intent to commit a crime. And so if you watch a lot of law shows, you might have heard this term, and it's used a lot in legalese. So I pose the question to you again, would you add this? Would you not add it? Or does it depend? I'll give you a couple seconds to tell me in the chat. Okay, so the third word that I have here, the third term that I have here is Hanukkah, which is a Jewish festival that is celebrated around December. Without any further context, do you add it? Yes. Do you not add it? No. Or does it depend? And finally, the fourth sort of term that I have on the slide is ostracize, which is just a verb that means to refuse to accept someone in society. So yes, no, depends. And then after you get your guesses in, I will go through sort of my answers for all of these. Okay, so hopefully you've had enough time to get your guesses in. And I'm going to tell you what I would do for our use cases at Dialpad. So the first term, the let's jump, is obviously a technical term that's used in figure skating. Dialpad is not in the business of doing transcription for the Olympics, and we're a business-to-business company, we specialize in business-to-business communication. And my guess is there aren't really a lot of companies that are selling let's jumps or something related to that to others. And it's also not really a thing that you expect to hear in casual conversation, since it's quite a technical term. And so I would choose not to add this at Dialpad. However, if you work at a company where you are responsible for doing closed captioning, for the Olympics, then yes, I would expect that you would know this technical term that's related to figure skating, which is one of the things that is done at the Olympics. Now, similarly for mens rea, that is a technical term in the legal field, and Dialpad does not deal with the legal field. So if you are making a software that is supposed to help court stenographers, then yes, I would expect you to know that term. I would say yes, add it. However, in the context of Dialpad, we're not really transcribing, law shows on Netflix, and we're also not really transcribing actual cases, sort of in courts. And again, it's not really something that, it's not a Latin phrase that people use regularly in conversation, so I would not add it to our lexicon. Hanukkah, however, is different. This is a festival, and it is something that often comes up in conversation. Maybe not often, but I guess at a certain time of year, it is not unlikely that people will talk about it to each other. It is also possible that you have a wholesaler trying to sell, I don't know, food to retailers that is during the season of Hanukkah. And in that case, it would actually be relevant to some of our customers to have this correctly transcribed. The one caveat to this is that there are different spellings of this word in English. And so I would double check whether we have a different spelling of Hanukkah in our lexicon already, in which case I wouldn't want to add a duplicate. And speaking of spelling, the fourth one was sort of meant to confuse you all because, or was meant to sort of be a gotcha, because that is ostracized spelt with an S and not a Z. And so the spelling, the version with the S is a UK spelling, and the version with the Z is what you would expect to see if you're in Canada or the US. So I guess my answer to this one is that it depends, because it depends on whether I am building a model that is meant to be used primarily by people in the UK or by, you know, people in another country where they would expect to see the British spelling. Versus if this is a US company and a US model, then I would definitely expect to see the pronunciation with the Z in it, and I would not want to add this. So hopefully that was helpful as an exercise to kind of illustrate this point about, you know, the difficulty of adding and not adding words to the lexicon. But my takeaway that I would like for you to sort of walk away from this problem with is that domain is king. And what you really need to do is you need to define your, or well, you don't need to define your domain. Someone higher up than you needs to define your domain and communicate that to you if you are just a lowly data scientist. And you need to know your domain that is communicated to you by other people. And so you need to know to be able to say that, you know, we don't transcribe, you know, the Olympics. And so this is not something that is in our domain. You need to know that. And in addition to that, you need to know your users and your use cases. So for example, the fact that like Hanukkah is discussed by people at the company, the fact that salespeople at my company sort of will build rapport with their prospects at the beginning of a call by referencing current events like football games and you know, festivals and holidays and things like that. That is a useful thing to know because it informs your decisions for whether you add something to the lexicon or you leave it out. And that is one way in which you can sort of balance what you add to your lexicon versus what you don't. So that was the first problem. Let's do a second one. So the second one is, whose names do I add to my lexicon? So I did a quick search of some name databases. I found one which had like 11,000 primary names and about 30,000 variations on all of them. I found another baby name database that had 70,000 baby names. So the question is, do you add all of them? Similar to before, Linguistics would make the argument that you should add all of them because if it's not in your lexicon, it simply doesn't have a chance of being transcribed. And what is the message that you're sending when you say that some people's names are more valuable than others? However, engineering constraints, as before, want you not to inflate your lexicon. There is also an additional concern here, which is, let's say that you don't have all of these names already in your lexicon. You have to source all of the names and you have to source their pronunciations as well. And so often with these name databases, it's very easy to get a list of like 70,000 names. However, there is a bunch of effort that needs to be spent in generating pronunciations for these names where you might have to hire more people to do that, and you know, you have to pay them and they have to spend time doing it. It's not sort of an instantaneous thing. And an additional sort of concern and consideration here is that it is pretty common for out-of-the-box lexica to be biased towards white and Western names and not names like mine, which is Vasundhara. And so, you know, again, when you sort of perpetuate that in your systems, that's not very nice, especially when you have a lot of users and a lot of customers and a lot of maybe even colleagues and teammates who have names that are not well represented just en masse in your lexica. So I want to do another quick exercise just to sort of get you thinking about some of these names. This is supposed to be an illustration of a sample of your users. And I want you to sort of spot the missing names. And what I mean by that is I sort of looked at the CMU dict, which is Carnegie Mellon's lexicon. A lot of people start with it. and then make modifications on top of it. It's a pretty famous lexicon that people use. And so I just kind of took the latest version of the lexicon and tried to see whether some names were in it or not. And so I would like you to guess whether these names are in the CMU dict or not. So let's start with Shayna. You can just say, Y for yes and N for no in the chat. Yes or no for Shayna. So Shayna is not in the CMU dict. There is a nearby name, which is Shanna without the Y, but it's not the same name because it's not pronounced the same. So I don't think I should count that. What about Arun? Arun is a very common Indian name. Do you think that that is in the CMU dict or not? So it turns out that Arun is not in the CMU dict, which actually I found quite surprising, since it's quite a common name. So the third one is the name Raj, another common Indian name. Do you think it is in the lexicon or not? So Raj is in the CMU dict. However, it has the pronunciation, the sort of anglicized US pronunciation of Raj and not Raj. But I think I think we can give them that. So the fourth name that I have is Tamir, as in Tamir Rice. Yes or no, do we think it's in the CMU dict? It is not a name that is in the CMU dict. And finally, the fifth one that I have here is Barack. Do we think that Barack, as in Barack Obama, is in the CMU dict? So it turns out that Barack is in the CMU dict. However, it has the wrong pronunciation. It has the pronunciation Barack. So personally, I don't think that this one should count. But anyway, I hope that was an interesting exercise, to figure out that like you can't really make a lot of assumptions about this, and you may have colleagues with these names, or you may know people with these names, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are being adequately represented in a lot of the tech that's just sort of built out of the box. And so my sort of takeaway here with how you balance the fact that like there's a lot of names out there that probably are not in your model right now, is that you should put your users first. Really what's important is your users. I hope that you're thinking about your users and focusing on their problems as opposed to just sort of speech recognition as a theoretical thing. Get your users' names right. That's what's important. It's very likely that you already have this information from a different part of the company. For example, at Dialpad, when people sign up, we get their names. And then beyond that, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit like name frequency databases. So when you have name databases that tell you that, this is like one of the most frequent names in all of North America or in the US or wherever your sort of domain of concern is, then that is just a low-hanging fruit to sort of set a cutoff that you can determine empirically based on your engineering constraints, and then say that, that is where you're going to cut it off. That's where you're going to add a bunch of names of a certain frequency and nothing below that to start. And then, from there, you can just go on with like ad hoc additions. So for example, when someone with a name who is with a name that's not represented in your lexicon becomes famous and becomes a topic of conversation that everybody is talking about in your domain, on your calls. So for example, when Zaila Avant-Garde recently won the spelling bee, a lot of people were talking about her, and her name was not in our lexicon. And so you will choose probably to make some ad hoc additions or deletions depending on, when things become topical, when people's names become topical, depending also on the magnitude and the spread, and how long you think it will last. So a similar thing that's not related to names was COVID-19 and coronavirus, both of which were words that were not in our lexicon, but we had to add them obviously because everybody has been talking about that for the last year and a half. All right, so that was problem 2 and takeaway 2. Let's move on to problem 3, which is simply variation exists. So what now? And variation, I'm sort of using a broad definition of variation here, a linguistic definition of variation. You have a lot of differences between people in pronunciations, in word choice. So for example, some people say car park, some people say parking lot, and even in the way they pronounce these words. So, I say car park, but, my friend would say car park. There can also be differences in syntax, so how you put words together into sentences. And there's variation, as we've already seen a couple of times now, in terms of spellings. So how do you deal with all of this? Because linguistics wants you to build a model for each person that you are catering to. It wants you to make sure that you're getting their pronunciations exactly right and transcribing those correctly, and that that you are addressing their various word choices and their syntax, and you have that adequately represented in language modeling, and that you're spelling their name correctly when you type it out, or when your model transcribes it. Now, on the other hand, your inner software engineer is probably going to have a conniption when they hear the inner linguist say that, because the idea of building a model for each individual user is ridiculous. It is something that doesn't scale at all. The training doesn't scale, especially if you're going to try and add words on a systematic basis to all of the models. That is never going to scale. And so you need something more. You need some way of balancing these concerns, because obviously you do want to address variation in the ways that people speak. But you can't do it necessarily by giving each person their own individual model that you train from scratch every time on their data, because it's also pretty hard to source individual people's data. So just to kind of get you thinking about this, I want to again give you some examples. So the first one is an abundance of Catherines. So it's various different spellings of the name Catherine. They're spelling variants. Sometimes they have a K, sometimes they have a C, sometimes they have a Y or an E or an A. And all of these are different Catherines. In fact, I'm pretty sure that I know a Catherine of each of these kinds in real life. And so how do you handle that in your model? Do you add all of them to your lexicon? Do you have some other way of resolving this? The second example, and this is just a sort of an invitation to think about it, not necessarily tell me in chat how you would handle this, because this, hopefully keeps you sort of thinking for a while, because none of these have simple answers. The second example is kia ora, which, for those of you who don't know, is a Maori greeting that has made its way into New Zealand English. And if you're someone who doesn't know this about New Zealand English, or who doesn't sort of have any reason to know that, you're probably not interested in having this in your lexicon, because you probably never say it at all. However, if you are a speech recognition company that has a presence in New Zealand, then you're going to, if you don't have this in your lexicon, you're going to miss a whole lot of conversations. You're going to miss a significant chunk of like the opening of a lot of conversations. And people are going to be pretty disappointed if you can't transcribe kia ora, because that's a very common greeting. So what do you do then if you have a speaker from South London? Like, let's say they've grown up in South London, and you're a US company. How do you handle them? Like, what are you doing with them? Because they obviously sound very different from, somebody who has grown up in, I don't know, Southern Texas. And also, what do you do if that same speaker who grew up in South London and is from South London works in Vancouver, Canada? How does that change things? How does that change how you approach the problem? Are you even thinking about that? The fact that that is a very common scenario, that people move around in the world. A location isn't representative of, isn't necessarily representative of a way of speaking. So here I would say that the answer is really not that simple. This is not something that I can just give you one clear solution to. Obviously, it's informed by the previous things, that you should know your users, and that, domain is also very important. Obviously, you should know whether New Zealand English is important to you or not as a company, and decide based on that. And also use your users and get sort of as much information as you can from them. But my third takeaway that I want to give you, and sort of idea that you can run with, is that you should get creative. You should find creative ways of solving problems. So, like I mentioned earlier, linguistics wants you to have an individual model for individual people. But software engineering wants you to just train as few models as possible. So how can you make both of those things happen? How can you train a minimum number of generic models, but find ways, like subtle ways of customizing it on a user level basis, or on the device or on the fly, so that you're not running into training costs every time, but each user is getting a subtly customized model for them. So could you do something like post hoc formatting? Could you format people's names in the way in which their name is spelled, because you have that information? Could you build locale specific models so that when you have a model that caters to your New Zealand English speakers in New Zealand, that sort of exists and is there as an option for them, versus a different model that is used for, say, your speakers of English in California? And also, like I said before about the example of the speaker from South London who had moved to Vancouver, Canada, are you giving people an option to opt into a different locale from what they're in if they don't sound like the majority of the training data that you have for that locale's model? It's really important to make sure that you aren't leaving users behind in your technical solution that is trying to just, wave a magic wand and solve everything. And so those are things that you should consider while you address some of these problems of variation. And that is sort of my third takeaway. And so I guess in conclusion, my big thing that I would like for you to walk away with from this talk is that it's really important to look at your data. I would be a very bad data scientist if this wasn't my takeaway. This should be every data scientist's takeaway at every talk ever, is sort of my philosophy on this. Obviously, data is important in the sense that you should be looking at your hypothesis transcripts that your model generates, and you should be comparing them to the reference transcripts to try and look for systematic patterns in the things that you miss and the mistakes that you made. But there's so much more than that. There's so much more than just that data and the audio data. There's the sort of domain knowledge, like I mentioned. It's in takeaway one, having a clearly defined domain is super important. You need to know it. You need to know your use cases and your users to make sure that you're not leaving them behind and that you're addressing their needs. So make sure that you actually have a way of getting input from them. Takeaway number 2 was put your users first. Use everything that you can get from them. All of that is data. Talk to them, use the metadata that they've given you in other parts of your company, have ways of getting feedback from them, have like an open line of communication. It is really important to put your users first. And that is sort of the thing that will help you resolve the conflict between linguistics wanting to solve all of the problems in the world and software engineering wanting you to really just pare it down. And finally, you should also look at your data to prioritize what fixes to solve first. So you should really just, if you have a situation where you have a lot of speakers, like maybe you have New Zealand English speakers and you haven't addressed them so far, but you need to, you should identify your most underserved users, maybe that's the group, and you should handle their variation first, and you can use creative solutions to do that. It doesn't always have to be building a new model for a group of people. It can sometimes be finding clever ways to customize existing models to sort of work better for them. So, so that's my takeaway. Look at your data. And if you would like to chat with me more about any of this stuff, my website is vasundaragautam.com, and I have a bunch of different contact methods on there. And that is all I have. So I guess we will move to Q&A right after this.
Ready for live Q&A with our speaker? Join us in the live stream now. Scroll down to find the link in our subsession box below.